March 14th, 1932. Rochester, New York State. 900 East Avenue. Monday. Heavy gray skies hang outside the windows, typical of a protracted spring in the north of the United States of America. Inside the colossal mansion spanning 35,000 square feet stands an unnatural, dense silence. The house, built of reinforced concrete specifically for fire protection, resembles a fortress. In the hall, where echoes of organ music usually reverberate, only the muffled footsteps of the servants can be heard now. The time on the clocks is about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Suddenly, this sterile silence is shattered by one sharp, dry sound. It is neither thunder nor falling furniture. It is a gunshot. The sound comes from the second floor, from the private quarters of the master of the house. The servants freeze. Downstairs, in the service areas, panic erupts instantly, suppressed by the strict discipline of this house. People exchange glances. They know who is upstairs. They know that there is only one person in the bedroom now. The man who practically built this city single-handedly. The man whose name is printed on yellow boxes of photographic film in every home from Paris to Tokyo. George Eastman. Dr. Audley Stewart, the magnate's personal physician, who was in the house, is the first to rush up the grand staircase. He flings open the massive door to the bedroom. The scene that confronts him is frighteningly neat. On the bed lies a 77-year-old man. He is dressed impeccably, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than death. On his bare chest, right over the heart, lies a neatly folded damp terry cloth towel. This is no random detail. This is a cold, calculated engineering solution. Eastman, a technocrat to the very last second, placed the wet towel to cool the powder gases, prevent the clothing from igniting from the flash, and muffle the sound of the shot. He wanted to go cleanly. Beneath the towel is concealed the bullet's entry wound. Next to his hand lies a blued automatic Luger pistol. Smoke slowly rises toward the high ceiling. On the bedside table, next to his glasses, lies a yellow sheet of paper torn from an ordinary lined notepad. There are no tearful farewells, no accusations, no lengthy philosophical treatises. Just one sentence, written in the firm, bold handwriting known to bankers around the world. The text reads, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" Signature, G.E. Just 1 hour before this moment, in the very same room, restrained laughter had sounded. Lawyers and Eastman's closest friends were present here, including Secretary Alice Hutchinson and witnesses. Eastman was in high spirits. He even joked. They had gathered to sign the codicil, an official addition to his will. This was the final legal formality, the last cog in the mechanism of his legacy. Eastman carefully read the documents, signed them, and looked at those present with a clear gaze. As soon as the ink dried, he asked everyone to leave him alone. He told them he wanted to rest a bit and write a note. The friends went downstairs, confident that the old man was simply tired from the paperwork. No one noticed as he took the pistol from the desk drawer. George Eastman's death was not a spontaneous act of despair. It was an execution that he had scheduled for himself after a thorough analysis of the data. The man who gave humanity a way to preserve moments of life forever decided to erase himself from reality, exactly at the moment when he considered his resource expended. At the moment the bullet pierced the left ventricle of his heart, Eastman's fortune was estimated at tens of millions of dollars, which in modern terms amounts to billions. He was one of the most influential people of the era, a philanthropist, a visionary. But in this room, permeated with the smell of burned gunpowder, money meant nothing. Only the animal terror of losing control mattered. The news of the shot spreads instantly. Rochester's telephone lines are overloaded. Reporters storm the mansion gates. Newspapers prepare extra editions with headlines screaming about the tragedy. The world is shocked. Everyone knows the glossy side of the Kodak company's success story, the story of the poor boy who became the king of the industry. But no one standing now outside the mansion fence understands the true nature of this act. To understand why he pulled the trigger right then, we need to forget about his wealth. We need to rewind the film back to the very beginning and see that darkness which drove him forward all his life. We must see not the millionaire, but the son who made a terrible vow while looking at his father's ruined life. To decipher the code of the suicide in the East Avenue mansion, we must go back 70 years to a world that looked entirely different. George Eastman's story begins not with a silver spoon in his mouth, but with a catastrophic financial collapse that forever deformed his psyche. He was born on July 12, 1854, in the small village of Waterville, New York State. His father, George Washington Eastman, was a man of ideas, a dreamer who founded the Eastman Commercial College. He sold hope for success to others, but could not hold the foundation of his own life. When little George was only 7 years old, his father died from a severe brain disorder. The death of the family head in the mid-19th century meant not just grief, it meant instant social downfall. The family was left without means of subsistence. All property, all dreams of the commercial college crumbled to dust. George's mother, Maria Kilbourne Eastman, a woman with a steel core inside, decided to move to Rochester. But this move was not a journey to a better life. It was a flight from poverty that led them into even greater need. Maria was forced to turn their modest home into a boarding house for strangers. Little George grew up to the sounds of strangers' footsteps in the corridor, inhaling the smells of cheap food that his mother cooked for the boarders. He saw her, an educated woman from a respectable family, washing strangers' laundry and scrubbing floors to earn a few cents. This image of his mother, bent over a dirty floor, burned an indelible mark into Eastman's consciousness. It was a primal trauma. It was in these years that a pathological, animal fear of poverty took root in him. He vowed to himself that he would never depend on others and would never again allow his family to want. This fear became the fuel for his ambitions, far more powerful than a simple thirst for glory. At 14 years old, George Eastman's childhood officially ended. He was forced to drop out of school to support the family. His first job was as a messenger boy in an insurance company. His salary was only $3 a week. Think about that figure. $3 for 6 days of grueling labor. But even then, as a teenager, he displayed traits that would later make him a titan. He kept track of every spent coin in a small notebook. 5 cents for lunch, 10 cents for clothing, no entertainments. Every figure in his notebook was an act of control over the chaos of life. A few years later, he got a position as a junior clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank. During the day, he was part of the faceless machine of capitalism, counting other people's fortunes that he could never have. He saw how money works, how it creates power. But in the evenings, he returned home to his mother, into their cramped world. He was an outsider. To Rochester's elite, to old money, he was nobody. Just another clerk with ink stains on his fingers. But he had an advantage that the heirs of wealthy families lacked: hunger, and an engineering mindset capable of seeing inefficiency where others saw the norm. The turning point came in 1877, when Eastman turned 24 years old. He was planning a vacation in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. A bank colleague advised him to document the trip with photographs. Eastman, always inclined toward technology, agreed. He bought a full set of photographic equipment. And it was right here that he encountered the absurdity that changed the world. Photography of that time was not art for the masses, but torture for the elite. To take one shot, an entire caravan of equipment was required. A camera the size of a microwave oven, a heavy wooden tripod, glass plates, barrels of chemicals, a developing tent. The process was called wet collodion. The photographer had to apply the sticky emulsion to the glass in complete darkness, insert it into the camera, take the shot, and develop it while the emulsion was still wet. All of this had to be done in a few minutes or the shot was lost. It was expensive, dirty, heavy, and required the knowledge of a professional chemist. Eastman looked at this mountain of equipment, for which he had given up a significant portion of his savings, and his accountant's brain rebelled. He didn't even go to Santo Domingo. Instead, he posed the question that was worth billions. Why does it have to be so complicated? Why does capturing a moment require a pack horse? His mother's kitchen turned into a laboratory. During the day, he worked at the bank, maintaining the mask of a diligent clerk, and at night, he became a mad scientist. He slept 3 or 4 hours. His hands were constantly burned by chemicals. His clothes permeated with the smell of ether and silver. He read British photography journals, trying to find the recipe for the dry plate, a technology that would allow the emulsion to be applied in advance and the plates stored for months. His motivation was not artistic. He did not want to create masterpieces. He wanted to optimize the process. This was the approach of a pure pragmatist. He saw a market where none existed. Rich people hired photographers. The poor drew portraits with charcoal. Eastman, however, saw a world in which every person, regardless of education, could preserve the face of a loved one. He spent 3 years in the darkness of this kitchen. Hundreds of failed experiments. The emulsion curdled, blackened, did not react to light. His mother, Maria, was his only assistant and spectator. She supported him when he fell asleep right on the floor from exhaustion. It was in this stuffy kitchen, among jars of gelatin and silver bromide, that the philosophy of the future giant was formed. He realized that the key to success was not in teaching people to be photographers, but in removing photography from the equation, making the technology invisible. By 1888, he had found the formula. He created a machine for coating dry plates that worked faster and better than any human hand. But Rochester's old money world still looked down on him. Local investors laughed at the idea of mass photography. Who needs it? Why does an ordinary person need a camera? They did not see what Eastman saw: human vanity and fear of oblivion, the most reliable currencies in the world. He was ready to challenge the system. He was ready to stake all his savings, his entire life, to prove that his vision was correct. But to scale, he needed capital and a partner. He needed a person who would believe in the crazy idea of turning complex chemistry into a child's toy. Eastman stood on the threshold of transformation, from a lone inventor into a ruthless entrepreneur. And his first victim was to be the complexity of the world itself. He was preparing to simplify reality to the press of one button. In the history of every great capital, there is a moment when the idea must confront the reality of money. For George Eastman, that moment came in 1880. He had revolutionary dry plate production technology, but he lacked the means to take it beyond his mother's kitchen. His banking caution struggled with his entrepreneurial zeal. He needed a partner, But not just a wallet. He needed a person who would risk betting on what did not yet exist. Fate, as often happens in stories of this scale, was literally behind the wall. In the Eastman house, Colonel Henry Strong rented a room. He was a classic representative of the old world, a man with sideburns and military bearing who had made his fortune producing whips for horse-drawn carriages. Imagine the irony. The man whose business was built on horsepower, a technology that had only a few decades left to live, became the financier of the technology that would define the 20th century. Eastman came to Strong not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. He showed him not just a chemical formula, but a mathematical model of the future market. Strong, being an experienced businessman, saw in the eyes of the young clerk that very obsession that brings dividends. On January 1st, 1881, they shook hands. Strong invested $1,000 in the venture, a sum equal to the annual salary of a good worker of that time. Thus was born the Eastman Dry Plate Company. It was a marriage of two worlds, old capital smelling of leather and horse sweat, and a new era smelling of chemicals and silver. But the path upward is never a straight line. Shortly after starting production, Eastman faced a catastrophe that could have destroyed any other person. In the summer of 1882, professional photographers began to complain. The plates sold by the company were spoiling. The images disappeared, covered in fog. This was the nightmare of any manufacturer, a defective product already on the market. The cause was a bad batch of gelatin, but customers didn't care. The reputation of the young company hung by a thread. It was at this moment that Eastman's true character was revealed. Instead of denying the problem or quietly replacing part of the goods, he made a decision that contradicted all laws of short-term profit. He announced a full recall of all plates from the market. He refunded all buyers. This decision brought the company to the brink of bankruptcy. He lost all earned funds and went into debt. But he bought something more valuable than dollars. He bought trust. He declared to the market, "We are not selling glass with chemicals. We are selling a guarantee of results." This step became the foundation on which the Kodak brand would later be built. Having escaped the crisis, Eastman realized the main vulnerability of his business: glass. Glass plates were heavy, fragile, and inconvenient. To make photography mass market, he needed to get rid of the weight. He needed a new carrier. Flexible, light, endless. In 1884, he patented roll film. First on a paper base, later on celluloid. This was a revolution. Instead of hauling a box of glass, a photographer could now carry a roll in his pocket, capable of capturing dozens of moments. But Eastman went even further. He realized that professionals were too conservative. The real money lay in the pockets of ordinary people, those who had never held the developer in their hands. In 1888, Eastman launched a product that changed the anthropology of humanity: the Kodak camera. It was a simple black box, already loaded with film for 100 shots. The price, $25. This was big money, roughly $600 in modern equivalent, but it was accessible to the middle class. The marketing strategy was genius in its simplicity. You press the button, we do the rest. A person bought the camera, took 100 shots, sent the camera by mail to the factory in Rochester, and a week later received back the printed photographs and a reloaded camera. The name Kodak itself was the result of cold calculation, not inspiration. Eastman sought a word that meant nothing in any language in the world, a word that could not be distorted or mistranslated. He loved the letter K. He considered it a strong, sharp letter. He sat with a set of letters from a children's game and shuffled combinations until he came up with Kodak. The sound of the camera shutter translated into phonetics: aggressive, short, unforgettable. With the success of the camera came the physical embodiment of Eastman's ambitions. In the north of Rochester, on State Street, an industrial monster began to grow: Kodak Park. It was not just a factory, it was a city within a city. Kilometers of brick walls, its own power plants, fire department, railroad. Here, behind high fences, in the complete darkness of the workshops, magic was created. Eastman controlled everything. He knew the chemical composition of every batch of emulsion, knew the cost of every brick. Eastman's social status transformed. From a poor clerk, he turned into the largest employer in the region. Rochester's old aristocracy, which had once looked down on him, now had to reckon with the new power. But Eastman did not seek to become one of them in their salons. He was building his own world. He still lived with his mother, but the scale of his possessions no longer fit within the framework of an ordinary home. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Kodak company had become a global monopoly. Profits were measured in millions. Eastman became one of the richest people in America. But inside him grew a new need. He needed a space that would reflect his inner world: strict, grandiose, and lonely. He needed a house that would become not just a dwelling, but a monument to his victory over the chaos of poverty. Thus was born the idea of the mansion on East Avenue. In 1902, construction began. Eastman approached this project the same way as building a factory, with total control. He hired architect John Foster Warner, but made every decision himself, from the placement of windows to the type of wood for the parquet. This house was to become a physical extension of his personality, a place where technology meets art, and public grandeur conceals private loneliness. We are approaching the moment when money ceased to be the goal and became a tool for creating his own reality. The house he was building was intended to become a fortress for two people, himself and his mother. But fate, as we will see, prepared a completely different scenario for this palace. The grandeur he was erecting from stone and concrete would soon become a golden cage in which the echo of footsteps would sound too loudly for one person. By 1905, construction at 900 East Avenue was completed. The result was not just a mansion, but an architectural X-ray of its creator's soul. This building, executed in the colonial revival style, stood like an impregnable bastion amid Rochester's gardens. If you look at the facade, you will see classical columns and symmetry designed to inspire respect. But if you look at the blueprints, you will see paranoia. George Eastman, whose fortune already numbered in the tens of millions, feared one thing more than bankruptcy: fire. The entire house, from basement to attic, was cast from reinforced concrete. It was a bunker disguised as a palace. Wooden panels, expensive plaster, marble, all this was merely a decorative shell concealing the fireproof skeleton. Eastman built a house that could not be destroyed, a house that was to outlast the centuries, like an Egyptian pyramid. Inside this concrete ark, spanning 35,000 square feet, were 50 rooms. Each one was a manifesto of order and control. Let us mentally walk through the grand entrance. The first thing that strikes the visitor's senses is the smell. It is not the smell of an old house with dusty carpets. It is the smell of expensive flowers. Eastman spent fortunes on greenhouses. Fresh orchids and roses were changed daily. He hated wilting. In his house, eternal spring was always to reign. even when snowstorms raged outside the windows of New York State. The central nervous hub of the house was neither the living room nor the study, but the winter garden, a two-story space with a glass dome. Here grew palm trees several meters tall. Eastman, an engineer to the marrow of his bones, subjugated even nature. He created a closed ecosystem where temperature and humidity were regulated with maniacal precision. Here he often sat in the evenings, surrounded by tropical greenery, while outside the temperature dropped below zero. This was an act of domination. Money allowed him to ignore the climate. But the loudest symbol of his psychology was music. Eastman loved music, but paradoxically, he himself could not play any instrument and could not read notes. His solution was to purchase the most complex musical machine of that time. In the heart of the house was embedded a giant Aeolian organ. The pipes of this instrument, numbering in the thousands, were hidden behind grilles in the walls, permeating the building like arteries. Music in Eastman's house served a specific function. It was not just entertainment, it was a sound barrier. Eastman hated the physiological sounds of human existence. He was repulsed by hearing the clink of forks against plates or the sounds of chewing food. Therefore, every morning, exactly at 7:30, when he came down for breakfast, the organist began to play. The music had to be loud enough to drown out daily life, but majestic enough to elevate the moment of consuming porridge to a religious ritual. In this house, even silence was designed. The mansion's technical equipment was decades ahead of its time. Here was installed a centralized dust removal system, pipes in the walls to which a hose could be connected in any room. The house had an internal telephone network with 22 extensions. An electric elevator, paneled in mahogany, glided between floors. Eastman turned his house into a machine for living, where every need was satisfied by pressing a button. His company's slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest," became the principle of his daily life. But who lived in these 50 rooms, among the masterpieces of Rembrandt and Van Dyck, which Eastman began to collect with the same methodicalness as he bought up patents? There was no wife, no children, no noisy Gatsby-style parties where champagne flows like a river. In this vast space lived only two people, George and his mother, Maria. Eastman's relationship with his mother was the axis around which this entire world revolved. She was the only woman he ever truly loved. For her, he built this palace. For her, he installed the elevator as her legs were weakening. The best room in the house, filled with light and the softest fabrics, belonged to her. This creates a frightening contrast. Imagine a dining hall capable of seating 30 guests, a long table of polished oak, sparkling crystal, silver utensils. And at this table sit only two, an elderly woman and her aging bachelor son. They eat under the roar of organ pipes, surrounded by an army of dozens of servants who move silently, like shadows. The servants in Eastman's house were selected with particular care. They were not just household staff. They were personnel operating under Kodak's corporate standards. Each had clear instructions. Eastman could fire the gardener if a flower bed was not perfectly symmetrical. He could reprimand the cook if the dessert deviated from the recipe by a gram. He controlled this house as rigidly as his factories in Kodak Park. For him, there was no difference between managing a global corporation and managing a household. Both required absolute discipline. The walls of this house witnessed not family warmth, but the triumph of will. Here, decisions were made that changed the world industry. Here, in the library filled with rare books, Eastman negotiated with lawyers, destroying competitors. But the higher the walls of his greatness rose, the more obvious the emptiness inside became. All this concrete, all this marble, all these thousands of organ pipes served one purpose: to fill the vacuum that formed where other people had personal lives. By 1907, when Maria Eastman was already a deeply ill woman, the house turned into a golden cage. The grandeur of the interiors began to oppress. The space created for protection began to turn into a labyrinth of loneliness. Eastman, surrounded by the luxury he had dreamed of in his impoverished childhood, began to realize the terrible irony. He built a perfect house, but there was no one to inherit this order. And it was at this very moment, at the peak of his power, that fate dealt a blow from which neither concrete, nor money, nor genius could protect him. The blow struck the only vulnerable point of this Iron Man. On June 16, 1907, a silence descended on the 900 East Avenue mansion that even the organ could not drown out. In one of the upper bedrooms, surrounded by the best doctors that money could buy, Maria Kilbourne Eastman passed away. She was 85 years old. To the whole world, the elderly mother of a wealthy industrialist had died. For George Eastman, the only person for whom his universe existed, had died. On that day, the iron mask that Eastman had worn for 50 years cracked. The servants, accustomed to seeing their master impassive like his cameras, witnessed a frightening scene. Eastman, the man who could fire an employee for a stain on his shirt, sobbed. He did not just cry, he howled in pain. Later, he would write in his diary words that reveal the full depth of his emotional dependence. When my mother died, I cried all day. I could not stop, even if my life depended on it. His mother's death became a tectonic shift. At the age of 52, George Eastman was left absolutely alone in a 50-room house. He had no wife, no children, no mistress. His personal life was sterile. The psychological umbilical cord linking him to his mother was severed by death, and he found himself in a vacuum. It is here that the darkest and most morally ambiguous chapter of his life begins. Grief did not make him softer. On the contrary, having lost the only source of warmth, Eastman froze his heart. In business, he turned into a real predator. If at the beginning of his path he was an innovator, now he became a monopolist obsessed with total control. In the period from 1907 to 1910, the Kodak company controlled nearly 90% of the world's photographic film market. This was not just domination, it was a dictatorship. Eastman used a scorched earth tactic. He bought up competitors not to use their technologies, but to close their factories and eliminate alternatives. He created a system in which photo shops wanting to sell Kodak products were not allowed to display goods from other companies. The federal government of the United States began to pay attention to this giant. Antitrust lawsuits were being prepared against the company. Eastman was called the Rockefeller of photography. In the press, he was depicted as a soulless shark of capitalism. And there was some truth in this. He paid high wages but demanded absolute obedience. He introduced a dividend system for workers, wage dividends, which was revolutionary for that time, but did it not out of kindness but out of pragmatism, to prevent the creation of unions. He bought loyalty because he did not believe in devotion. But in this man lived a screaming contradiction. The same ruthless monopolist who strangled competitors began to give away his fortune at a frightening speed. After his mother's death, money lost its meaning for him as a means of accumulation. It became a burden. Here enters the second important female figure in his life, Josephine Dickman. She was not his mistress in the physical sense. She was the wife of his close friend and business partner, George Dickman. After her husband's death, Josephine became Eastman's closest confidant. Their relationship is a riddle for historians. They traveled together, dined, attended concerts. But Eastman, faithful to his code of control, never crossed the line. He kept her at arm's length, like a museum exhibit. Josephine was the catalyst for his transformation, but not through love, but through intellectual partnership. She helped him find targets for his gigantic capitals. Eastman began an anonymous philanthropy campaign. He donated $20 million to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology under the pseudonym Mr. Smith. He built dental clinics in London, Paris, Brussels, Rome, and Stockholm. Why teeth specifically? Because he himself suffered from terrible tooth pain and, as a pragmatist, decided that a nation's health starts with a healthy mouth. He invested millions in the University of Rochester, creating a medical school and a music school. But the viewer must ask the question, what drove him? Was it atonement for the sins of the monopolist? Or was it an attempt to buy the immortality he could not achieve through children? His charity was as cold and systematic as his business. He did not simply give money to beggars on the street. He invested in institutions. He wanted efficiency. Even in good deeds, he remained a technocrat. By the beginning of the 1920s, Eastman had become a living monument to himself. He was incredibly rich, respected, but deeply unhappy inside. In his mansion, the organ still played, but now only he listened to the music. He hosted Sunday musical evenings for the city elite, where hundreds of guests enjoyed his hospitality. But the host himself often stood in the shadows, watching the fun with a detached expression. He was the director of others' happiness, remaining a spectator in his own life. At this time, somewhere deep in his body, the timer of a bomb that would destroy his world began to tick. While he was building an empire and giving away millions, his own cells began to betray him. The disease crept up slowly, masquerading as age-related fatigue. Eastman, who was accustomed to controlling everything, from the chemical composition of film to the temperature in the greenhouse, would soon face an enemy with whom it was impossible to negotiate, and whom it was impossible to buy. This moral conflict, the creator who brings joy to millions of people through photography, but himself is incapable of simple human joy, leads us to the final act of the tragedy. His body, his temple, which he always kept clean and orderly, began to turn into a prison. And for a man who valued independence above all, this was worse than death. His mother's death freed him from obligations to the past. The disease would force him to make a decision about the future. A decision that would require not a checkbook, but a pistol. By 1930, George Eastman's body, this impeccable mechanism that had served him for 76 years, began to fail. The doctor's diagnosis sounded vague, but the verdict was clear. They called it hardening of the cells in the lower spine. Today we know it as spinal stenosis, the narrowing of the space within the spine that compresses the nerves. For any other old man, this would have been just an age-related illness, pain to be endured, a cane to lean on. But for Eastman, this was not a medical problem, but an existential catastrophe. All his life, he had built systems excluding error. He optimized chemical processes, logistics, finances. And now, for the first time, the system he could not optimize, his own biology, began to break down. The first symptom was his gait. The man whose steps had always been quick and decisive began to shuffle. His legs refused to obey the brain's commands.
He could no longer stand straight. Every step required a conscious effort of will. The pain was constant, but worse than the pain was the humiliation. He saw how the employees at Kodak Park looked at him, not with fear and respect as before, but with pity.
Pity was the feeling Eastman despised more than anything in the world. But the real horror was not in the physical sensations. The horror lived in his memory. The last 2 years of his mother Maria's life she spent in a wheelchair, absolutely helpless, dependent on nurses. Eastman watched her fade every day. He saw how a strong woman turned into an object of care. This image burned into his brain a phobia that millions of dollars could not cure. He called this condition invalidism. It was a word verdict: to become a burden, to lose autonomy, to turn into a defective part that, by the logic of his own business, should be written off. In 1931, the crisis reached its peak. Eastman, who had officially stepped down as company president back in 1925, while remaining chairman of the board of directors, realized that he was losing control over his last asset, his own dignity. He tried to fight. He underwent treatments, consulted the best luminaries of medicine, but the engineer inside him knew clearly the structure was worn out, repair impossible. It was at this moment that a fundamental transformation of his goal occurred. If previously his ambition had been creation, accumulation, and building, now his main task became completion. He began preparing for death just as methodically as he prepared the launch of a new factory. This was not panic. This was an audit. He began rapidly divesting himself of the remnants of his fortune. He did not want to leave behind the chaos of inheritance division. He wanted to determine the fate of every dollar himself. In the last years of his life, he gave away nearly $100 million. He supported education for African Americans in the South, funded scientific institutes, built hospitals. But now, his philanthropy took on a shade of urgency. He was in a hurry. He was clearing tails. The servants in the East Avenue mansion noticed the changes. The master became even more withdrawn. He sat for hours in the winter garden, gazing at the tropical plants that, unlike him, were full of life. He stopped playing the role of the great magnate. He became a man drawing up the balance sheet. In the winter of 1932, his condition worsened. He could barely move around the house without outside help. For a man accustomed to absolute independence, the necessity of leaning on a servant's shoulder was an unbearable torture. He felt the shadow of his mother's wheelchair enveloping him. He realized there was no more time. If he waited, the disease would take not only his legs, but his will. It would take from him the ability to pull the trigger. The decision was not made in a surge of emotions. It crystallized in his mind as the only correct strategic choice. In business, when a project became unprofitable and had no prospects, it was shut down. Eastman applied this corporate logic to himself. He decided to fire himself from life. In early March of 1932, he asked his doctor, Dr. Audley Stewart, to explain to him the precise anatomy of the human heart. He did not want to miss. He did not want to remain a cripple after a failed attempt. The doctor, perhaps suspecting the patient's intentions or simply obeying his authority, drew a diagram on Eastman's chest or explained exactly where the vital center was located. Eastman memorized these coordinates. In the last days before March 14th, he behaved frighteningly calmly. He put all papers in order. He made sure that the University of Rochester would receive the promised funds. He checked that all obligations to the servants were fulfilled. He left no unfinished tasks. His life resembled a perfectly cleared desk. On the morning of March 14th, when he called his friends to sign the codicil, it was not a request for help. It was the final inspection before handing over the facility. He laughed and joked because for him, the painful uncertainty had already ended. The plan was approved, the budget balanced. All that remained was to press the button. We returned to that point from which we began, the man in the empty room. But now we see not just a suicide, we see a man who rebels against nature. Eastman refused to accept the scenario written by biology. He decided to become the author of his own finale. In this act of self-destruction, his highest creative trait paradoxically manifested: the striving for complete control over chaos. He did not allow the disease to dictate terms. He left on his own terms. The shot that rang out at noon was not a cry for help. It was a period at the end of a sentence. A hard, black period, placed with ink of gunpowder and lead. George Eastman's story ended, but the echo of this shot began to transform into something else. A legend that would outlive both his money and his concrete house. On March 17th, 1932, Rochester froze. The city that George Eastman had built around his factories was saying goodbye to its architect. The funeral was held in St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Inside gathered the nation's elite, captains of industry, scientists, and politicians. But the real story was happening outside. On the streets stood thousands of ordinary people, workers from his factories, their wives, children. They stood in silence under the cold spring wind, seeing off the man who gave them not just jobs, but identity. However, in the coffin lay neither a hero nor a villain. There lay a man who took his life philosophy to its absolute, frightening, logical end. His death was not a tragedy in the classical sense, where the hero perishes from fate. This was the last business project of George Eastman. He closed the deal with life on his own terms, leaving us to deal with a legacy that turned out to be more complex than just billions of dollars. What remained after the smoke from the Luger shot cleared? The mansion at 900 East Avenue, this concrete bunker of loneliness, did not become a mausoleum. According to the will, it passed to the University of Rochester. Eastman, who so zealously guarded his privacy during life, arranged for his house to serve society. Years later, it transformed into the International Museum of Photography and Film. The irony of fate, the house built for the isolation of one person now receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The walls that heard only the steps of a lonely old man and organ music now hold millions of other people's memories captured on film. But Eastman's most dramatic legacy is not the house or the money, but the fate of his company. The story of the Kodak Corporation, after the founder's death, is a Greek tragedy about forgotten lessons. Throughout almost the entire 20th century, Kodak remained a global hegemon. In the 70s, they controlled 90% of the film market in the United States. The word Kodak was synonymous with photography. But the company forgot the main principle of its creator. George Eastman was not afraid to kill his own products. He destroyed the dry plate business to introduce film. He risked everything for the new. His heirs, the top managers of the late 20th century, chose a different strategy: preservation of the status quo. In 1975, Kodak engineer Stephen Sasson invented the first digital camera. But the company leadership shelved the invention, fearing that digital would kill their super-profitable film business. They tried to stop the future to preserve profits. Eastman, who hated stagnation, would never have made this mistake. In 2012, exactly 80 years after the founder's suicide, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The giant fell, crushed by the very digital revolution that it itself had engendered but feared to lead. The empire's building collapsed because it removed the load-bearing structure, Eastman's ruthless readiness to change. However, if we look deeper, we will see that Eastman defeated death in another way. He changed the very structure of human memory. Before him, the past was hazy, accessible only through unreliable stories or expensive paintings. Eastman democratized memory. He gave the laundress, the soldier, and the schoolboy the ability to stop time. Today, when we take out our smartphone to photograph a sunset or a child's smile, we, unbeknownst to ourselves, perform a ritual invented by Eastman. We try to defeat death and oblivion with the press of a button.
We all live in the world he designed.
A world where the visual image is more important than reality, where a moment does not exist if it is not captured. His suicide, this fatal shot, is now seen not as an act of despair, but as a final, eternal photograph. He did not want the world to see his wilting. He did not want history to remember him as a weak old man in a wheelchair, drooling. He wanted to remain in memory as strong, decisive, in control of the situation. The shot to the heart was his way of fixing the image before the film starts to spoil. He edited his biography, cutting out the chapter on helplessness. He left us a simple note: "My work is done. Why wait?" In these 4 words lies an abyss. This is a question that each of us must ask ourselves, not in the sense of a call to death, but in the sense of evaluating life. When is work truly done? How much is enough? Eastman knew the precise answer for himself. He measured his life with the accuracy of a pharmacist and closed the account.